Hi. I want to make a video today about an interesting and very simple technique that you can use to look at the question of, how strong is the evidence for lockdown? Um, and what I'm trying to share are some really basic concepts or basic statistical ideas that anybody can utilize that stay really close to the data of what actually happened rather than trying to make all sorts of inferences about things that we don't know. Because the center of really at the center of COVID-19 is a really clear thing we need to keep hold of, which is that we don't know the answer to certain questions. This technique is really, really simple. It's about scatter plotting. Two different things. So what we do know about the theory of lockdown is that lockdown is supposed to cut an exponential growth downwards. So we would have something that was exploding, growing by say 2.5 times every 4 days, and then lockdown comes in and it puts it into an immediate remission, if you like, shrinking slowly over time. So that's the theory of lockdown. Typically people are sort of saying, look, the R is 2.5, so every 4 days it's getting 2.5 times worse until lockdown, and then it's about 0.8 after lockdown. So then it sort of recedes. Every 4 days there's only 80% of the number of deaths, etc. So again, we're using a technique where we use deaths because it's more solid, and we use that number of the time between infection and death, which is estimated to be around 23 days. So, and that's a pretty firm estimate now. There are multiple papers out there and studies of like 16,000 patients in the NHS that give us that kind of timeline. Now, there is a huge asymmetry to death because it can take a lot longer than 23 days, but it's never much shorter. And so that's probably a better way of looking at, the best estimate we can of that average. So if there's a consequence to, obviously, if we let the exponential growth carry on for a considerable period or a long period of time, then the number of people that die, because before it turns, it's growing and growing and growing, before it turns when we lock down, it should be a really, really strong relationship between the timing of when we put in the lockdown and the total outcome of the outbreak. So what I did was I just literally looked for a way to simply scatter plot that so we could have a look at it. Now this chart here is simply put that way of looking at it. And I've started with the US because actually the decision making there is more to do with the number of deaths that occur and people reacting to it, because there's quite a good level of pushback, particularly in Republican areas trying not to lock down, which is quite interesting, which creates more spread. Whereas in Europe, as you'll see, you get more of a problem because there's a domino effect due to political expediency, which doesn't necessarily have to do anything to do with the number of deaths at the time the lockdown was put in, more to fit in with the countries around them. So it creates some different effect. But the US is actually slightly cleaner in that decision making. So all I did was I said, right, the 10th death is we use that as a marker because if we take the first death, sometimes there's a death that happens really, really early due to somebody who's flown in from somewhere and dies, and it doesn't relate to domestic deaths, if you like. By the time we get to the 10th death, it's usually a pretty firm single point at which, to anchor the start of the outbreak. We can never be sure how to tie all the outbreaks together, but the 10th death is just the generally accepted way to doing it. So we said, right, the time between the 10th death and the lockdown. So some people lock down after the 10th death, some people lock down before the 10th death. And so what we see on this chart is at the bottom here, just get my annotations. So here we have days from the 10th death until lockdown. So for instance, Georgia here is taking 15 days between lockdown to lockdown after the 10th death. Whereas if we go over here to New Mexico, they actually locked down 10 days before the 10th death occurred in the state. So we've got this range. And then what I've done is to take the deaths 51 days, that might sound arbitrary, I'll explain that in a minute, 51 days, the total deaths that have occurred in the outbreak, 51 days after lockdown. Why 51 days? Because you've got 23 days that are the delay between when infections that occur become deaths. So until 23 days after lockdown, we're not actually seeing the impact of lockdown yet. And then I've taken 28 days from that sort of 4-week period to see how that's going. And I've used 4 weeks because all of these states and all of the countries that we talk about were in lockdown for at least 4 weeks. And therefore, it's a safe way of looking at the number of deaths, because you don't want people coming out of lockdown and then that potentially leading to the fact that they came out of lockdown early. So we've got total deaths here, and that is actually the total deaths after 51 days in lockdown. So what do we see? So one more thing I should describe is these 2 dotted lines. So we've got to be a little careful. Whenever you put lines on here, the brain always wants to find patterns like, oh, look, all these dots all along these lines. I'll come back to that in a second. But this line here, this blue dotted line, that is an R rate of 3.7. So that's much higher than the standard estimates. And then this is the standard estimated R rate, which is 2.5. So this is theoretically based on our understanding of what the 10th death means, the R rate of 2.5, the turning to 0.8, what we would expect the deaths to be, depending on when someone locked down, if the initial R rate was 2.5 or 3.7. The post R rate is assumed to be 0.8 in these calculations, these model calculations, because otherwise, we should we'd just get massively different numbers because more to do with the spread after lockdown. So it gives you a kind of expectation, and what we can see from those dotted lines is they really strongly uptick to the right. So we should see all of the dots kind of line up on one of these lines. Clearly, we're not getting that. We can see that New York, there is an outlier, but it's completely away from any of these lines. New Jersey, right over here with all these states over there. And, again, we can see examples of people that locked down really early doing a lot better than those that were locked down really late. And so this relationship here, we can clearly see is not being followed because of that. I mean, the fact that we can take something that's all the way over on the left-hand side, Michigan, and then point to something all the way over there and sort of say, look, Michigan deaths were about 6,000, Georgia deaths are about 2.5 to 2,000. That makes no sense from a lockdown perspective. That's completely oppositional. There would be noise on this, but that's incredibly surprising. So what I'm going to do is just zoom in a little bit, get rid of these outliers, the sort of New Yorks, New Jerseys, the Pennsylvanias maybe, and just go in one more slide here. So we're removing those 2 outliers at the top and then see what we see. And we can really clearly see that now, this doesn't match. Now, some people will say, oh, but aren't these states somehow falling along this line? The problem you have with an analysis like that is that some states, and you're filtering it in the same way that I could draw a line like this and say that, oh, look, a whole bunch of states are following that line. That line would imply that the later you lock down, the better. So the way of filtering points to a line, we just should never do it because there are so many ways to fit that. So we can clearly see at that stage, and then we could go into this earlier stage and just have a quick look at that to see whether it looks any different. There we go. And again, we've got things that that don't make sense. We've got look, New Mexico, Kansas. Kansas does slightly better. New Mexico, it locks down so early, and yet it doesn't do an awful lot better. If we're honest, it's on a par with a whole bunch of states. On a par with a whole bunch of states. So there's really, the US is completely contrary to what we would expect. Instead of getting a strong trending line towards the right and up, we don't get that at all. We don't get that at all. We get a complete opposite. We can see from these charts, none of them are giving us what we should get from lockdown. So that points to a really serious flaw in the idea that lockdown is what's containing the virus. Because clearly there's a huge variation, but that variation doesn't seem to be tied to the timing of lockdown. And if it doesn't matter when you lock down, then it doesn't matter that you lock down, is the simple truth of it. That's the ultimate outcome. And you might say, well, what about Europe? Well, Europe's got this cascade effect, which means that it looks at first like there's a better effect. you can kind of see, well, hang on a minute. Now we've got countries up here which are late, countries down here which were earlier. Look at that, you know, that looks like a thing. And look, a whole group of countries down here that did better compared to these countries and to those countries. So in some ways, there is some sort of trend that seems to run through this chart. The problem is that that trend really isn't the exponential trend. So there's two massive, if we just took this region here, we did like a linear fit line, it is too steep, is the problem. We seem to have this kind of relationship. Doesn't matter, doesn't matter, doesn't matter, doesn't matter. Okay, if you didn't lock down by then, now it matters. And that doesn't fit with the idea that we're really looking at. If we zoom in as well and remove some of these countries, you'll see that the level of fit actually starts to break down quite quickly. So, you know, we've got things where, look, you've got the Netherlands doing so much worse than Switzerland, even though it was later. You've got Ireland locking down so much earlier, but only doing as badly as Switzerland. And you've got, you know, taking extreme case, Romania locking down all the way over here, and Greece doing absolutely fine and locking down pretty late. This is not the kind of evidence that you should see from a really strong relationship. There's all sorts of, you know, lines here, and if we go in one more stage, we can see that even in the earlies, you know, we're not getting those kind of relationships at all. This is where it really starts to break down, where you're sort of saying, yeah, do you know what? Look, Finland's over here. It's always prided on how well it responded, but Poland lockdowns earlier does worse than Finland, right? Romania and Estonia, same period of time, massively different outcomes. Yes, there's some sort of general trend across this. We can see where, you know, low to high again, but it's not the relationships we're expecting, and it's not very strong. There seems to be something in there that's roughly doing it, but it doesn't seem to match. The answer to that is, why do you get something not at all in the US and then roughly in the UK, sorry, roughly in Europe? And the answer, I believe, is just simply to do with a cascade effect of decision making. In Europe, it's much tighter. Countries tend to go into lockdown in groups. And then it just depends. Those countries that had outbreaks that were faster moving tended to be delayed in the fact that they could get their measures together, getting themselves together and making any kind of decision making and experimenting with this new technique. So what you see is probably an incidental correlation. Because people had smaller outbreaks, their 10th death was consequently much later. Therefore, if they went into lockdown because other people went into lockdown, and because it was such a domino effect, as we can see, you know, we're going from the 9th of March to 3 weeks later, and everybody's pretty much locked down. I mean, it's a very, very quick process. And because of that, you've got this cascade effect. In the US, there's also a cascade of people going into lockdowns, but there's a bit more drag and a bit more resistance, maybe. But either way, it's just a bit clearer, whereas here it just, I think because of the location of the 10th death, because of this, the speed of some of these outbreaks. But in Spain, the 10th death comes up so fast that, you know, they would have to be locking down so early. And Italy, of course, is one of the first countries hit, so it's harder for it to lock down, but it's hit hard, whereas a smaller outbreak might not have been detected, ironically. So Italy starts this chain reaction. It seems a much more plausible idea that that chain reaction might have caused an effect, or the decision-making cause and effect, than it's all lockdown. And all I would do is really point out the fact that, you know, this kind of data is very, very inconclusive. It creates some level of relationship, but it's certainly not conclusively connected to lockdown. And then when you go into America, and it's completely wrong, you've got no methodology to explain this. So it is really, really interesting that the correlations and the and that's probably the most poignant chart of just how much it doesn't work. It's so poignant how you have all of these countries going into lockdown at different times, and yet the outcomes don't seem to be much related to those government measures. I will probably come back and do a vlog that is based on techniques that are not so easy for the average person to use. Going into the WHO database, there's an Oxford government intervention database, and using a slightly more advanced technique to look at the impact of different government measures all over the world, thousands of measures all over the world being put into place over various dates, the R rate impacts. But this is just a very, very simple way that you could go to worldometers very easily. You could build, you could measure these things. So total deaths, once you get hold of lockdown, which is Google News actually, to find out when that was, and then you can get the measurements of when the 10th death was from worldometers, and then what the total deaths are 51 days after the date of lockdown, and then just build yourself a table and then build a scatter chart in Excel, and you could very quickly get to this answer. Anyway, I hope that video has been interesting. Thank you.